Pastor David Coleman stood at the pulpit of Riverside Community Church, speaking words he had repeated every third Sunday in October for the past 15 years, yet the weight of them never lessened. Lord, we lift up the souls of Clara May Coleman, Dorothy Jean Walsh, Beatrice Ann Harper, and Ruth Elizabeth Stone, 4 faithful servants who vanished from our midst 30 years ago today, leaving behind only questions and the aching certainty that evil had touched our sacred ground. The morning sunlight filtered through the amber-tinted windows of the modest sanctuary, casting warm geometric patterns across the weathered wooden pews where 73 souls sat in contemplative silence. David's eyes swept over the familiar faces, some lined with 3 decades of wandering, others belonging to younger members who had grown up knowing only the legend of the missing church mothers. All bore the particular expression that marked this annual ritual, a mixture of grief, reverence, and the uncomfortable awareness that their small community harbored an unsolved mystery. May they rest in the peace that surpasses understanding, David concluded, making the sign of the cross. Amen. Amen, the congregation responded, their voices creating a gentle echo in the vaulted ceiling that had heard this same prayer 30 times before. As the service transitioned into the closing hymn, David's gaze drifted to the 3rd pew on the left, where his Aunt Clara used to sit every Sunday morning. She had been the church pianist, her arthritic fingers somehow finding grace on the keys that the younger volunteers could never quite achieve. More than that, she had been his spiritual mother after his parents died in the car accident when he was 12. Clara had guided him towards seminary, encouraged his calling, celebrated his ordination with tears of pride streaming down her weathered cheeks. The congregation rose for "How Great Thou Art," but David remained motionless at the pulpit, watching. Mrs. Henderson's granddaughter struggled through the piano accompaniment. The girl was talented enough, but she played with technical precision rather than the soul-deep understanding that had made Clara's music feel like prayer itself. 30 years, and they still felt the absence in every Sunday service, in every church meeting, in every moment when the community gathered and found itself inexplicably incomplete. Sheriff Tommy Briggs caught David's eye from the back pew and offered a subtle nod of acknowledgement. Tommy had been a young deputy 30 years ago when the 4 women disappeared without a trace from their weekly Tuesday evening Bible study. The case file remained officially open, though everyone understood it had long since grown cold. The sheriff's presence at these memorial services had become as traditional as the prayers themselves, a gesture of respect for the living and accountability to the missing. As the final notes of the hymn faded, David stepped forward once more. He had planned to conclude with the standard benediction, but something stirred within him, a restlessness that had been building for weeks. "Before we close," he said, his voice carrying a weight that made several congregation members glance up sharply, "I want you to know that I haven't given up hope of finding answers." The afternoon sun slanted through the narrow windows of David's church office, illuminating dust motes that danced above his cluttered desk like tiny spirits, reluctant to settle. He had dismissed the last of the well-meaning parishioners an hour ago, those who lingered after service, to offer their annual words of comfort about Clara, their promises to keep praying, their gentle suggestions that perhaps it was time to let the Lord handle it and move on. David pulled open the bottom drawer of his oak desk, the same drawer he had opened on this date every year for the past 15 years. Inside lay a manila folder, its edges softened by time and handling, containing the only tangible remnants of that terrible October evening in 1982. His fingers traced the tab where someone had written, "Missing, October 19th, 1982, in fading blue, ink." The first photograph showed all 4 women standing together after Sunday service, just 3 weeks before they vanished. Clara stood on the left, her silver hair pinned in the neat bun she had worn for as long as David could remember, her floral dress pressed and proper. Dorothy Walsh beamed beside her, the church secretary whose infectious laugh had made even the most mundane committee meetings bearable. Beatrice Harper held her worn leather Bible against her chest like a shield, the same Bible she had carried through 40 years of faithful attendance. And Ruth Stone, the youngest at 62, had her arm around Clara's shoulders, the two of them having grown inseparable in their shared widowhood. "I should have insisted you stay home that night," David whispered to Clara's image, guilt pressing against his chest like a physical weight. "So you had that terrible cold, but you said the Lord's work couldn't wait for your comfort." He remembered their conversation from that morning 30 years ago. Clara had been preparing her lesson on the Book of Ruth. How fitting that her final Bible study would focus on loyalty and devotion, and David, fresh out of seminary and full of passionate idealism, had encouraged her dedication to the women's ministry. "Your influence on these ladies is profound, Aunt Clara," he had told her. "God is using you in ways you can't even see." Now those words tasted like ash in his memory. David lifted the second photograph, this one taken inside the church fellowship hall where the women had gathered every Tuesday evening. The round table where they had shared prayer requests and studied scripture sat empty in the image, photographed by the police as part of their investigation. 4 coffee cups remained, on the table still half full. 4 Bibles lay open to Ruth chapter 1. 4 chairs pushed back as if the women had simply stepped away for a moment and would return at any second. But the strangest detail had always haunted David the most. Clara's reading glasses, folded neatly beside her Bible, as if she had known. She wouldn't need them anymore. The following Tuesday arrived grey and humid, the kind of October morning that made David's joints ache in sympathy with the aging church building. He was reviewing his sermon notes when Earl Hutchins knocked on his office door, the elderly maintenance volunteer's weathered face creased with concern. "Pastor, we got ourselves a problem downstairs," Earl said, removing his John Deere cap to reveal thinning white hair. "That heavy rain we had Sunday night, it's done some damage to the foundation wall in the basement." David followed Earl down the narrow wooden steps that led beneath the sanctuary, their footsteps echoing in the confined space. The basement had always felt oppressive to him, low-ceilinged and poorly lit, with concrete walls that seemed to absorb sound and warmth. The church had used it primarily for storage since he'd arrived 15 years ago, though he knew it had once housed Sunday school classrooms back in the 1950s. "Look here," Earl said, directing his flashlight toward the east wall. A dark stain spread across the concrete like a bruise, and David could see where moisture had begun to weep through several hairline cracks. "Water's been seeping in something fierce. I'm worried about the structural integrity, especially with winter coming." David crouched beside the damaged wall, running his fingers along the wet concrete. The church's finances were already stretched. Thin, replacing the sanctuary's failing heating system had consumed most of their building fund, and the congregation's giving had declined steadily as long-time members aged and moved away or passed on. "How long have you been maintaining this building, Earl?" David asked, standing and brushing the dampness from his hands. 47 years come December," Earl replied with obvious pride. "Started helping my daddy when I was just 16. Learned every inch of this place from foundation to bell tower." He paused, studying the damaged wall with the critical eye of someone who had spent nearly half a century keeping the old building functional. "Thing is, Pastor, this wall here, it's always been the driest spot in the whole basement. Never had so much as a water spot before." David frowned, following Earl's flashlight beam as it traced the perimeter of the basement. "What's behind this wall? I mean, what's on the other side?" Earl scratched his grizzled chin, considering the question. "Well now, that's the peculiar thing. According to the original blueprints I seen, this wall here should back up to the old coal cellar that was sealed off back in the 60s when they converted to oil heat. But the dimensions never quite made sense to me." "What do you mean?" "I mean, this basement feels smaller than it ought to be, given the footprint of the church above us." Earl's voice dropped slightly, taking on the conspiratorial tone men used when discussing things that didn't quite add up. "Always wondered about that, but figured it wasn't my place to question the church fathers who came before." David felt a strange chill that had nothing to do with the basement's temperature. "You think there might be additional space back there?" "Could be, or could be my old brain playing tricks." Earl shrugged, but his eyes remained fixed on the seeping wall with obvious unease. 2 days later, David stood in the basement watching contractor Mike Hendricks tap methodically along the damaged wall with a small hammer, listening to the subtle variations in sound that revealed secrets hidden within concrete and stone. The younger man had driven out from Montgomery at Earl's insistence, bringing with him an arsenal of diagnostic equipment that seemed almost surgical in its precision. "Pastor Coleman," Mike said, pausing his tapping to consult a handheld device that beeped softly as he moved it across the wall's surface. "Mr. Hutchins was right to call me. This isn't just water damage. There's definitely a void behind this section." David felt his pulse quicken. "A void?" "Yes, sir. My ground-penetrating radar is showing empty space extending approximately 8 feet back from this wall." Mike moved the device in a slow grid pattern, its electronic chirping filling the basement's oppressive silence. "Looks like a room maybe 10 by 12 feet. Earl stepped closer, his maintenance veteran's instincts clearly engaged. "That can't be right. I've been in every part of this building for 47 years. "Well, you haven't been in this part," Mike replied, tapping the wall again. "The concrete here is different too, newer than the rest of the foundation. I'd say this wall was poured sometime in the 1980s, definitely not original construction." David's mouth went dry. The 1980s. The same decade Clara and the others had vanished. "Are you certain about the timing?" "Pretty certain. The concrete composition and the way it's cured, this was definitely retrofitted." Mike packed his equipment with the efficiency of someone accustomed to delivering unsettling news. "You want—" "My advice, Pastor? Get an engineer out here before you do anything else. If someone sealed off a room without proper ventilation or drainage, you could have serious structural issues." After Mike left, David and Earl remained in the basement, staring at the wall that had suddenly become the most significant feature in the building. The afternoon light filtering through the high, narrow windows seemed dimmer somehow, as if the revelation of hidden space had swallowed some of the illumination. "Earl," David said slowly, "you mentioned the original blueprints. Do you still have access to those? Should be copies in the church records, filed away with all the other historical documents." Earl's voice carried a tremor that David had never heard before. "Pastor, I need to tell you something. That wall there, it was damaged once before. Back in 1983, right after they did that big renovation project. I remember because I had to patch some cracks, but the church board told me not to worry about it. Said it was just settling." "What renovation project?" Earl's eyes met David's, and in them David saw the dawning realization of a man whose long-held assumptions were crumbling. "The one they did right after the ladies went missing. Deacon Morrison said they were reinforcing the foundation, but we were never allowed down here during the work." A sudden chill filled the basement, and somewhere in the walls around them, David could swear he heard the faintest sound, like someone tapping back. The Chambers County Courthouse stood like a monument to bureaucratic persistence, its red brick facade weathered by decades of Alabama heat and political storms. David climbed the worn marble steps Friday morning with a manila folder tucked under his arm, containing photocopies of every church document Earl had been able to locate in the cramped records room behind the sanctuary. Martha Wilkins greeted him in the Historical Society's cramped office on the second floor, her silver hair pinned back with the same precision she applied to organizing 4 decades of local records. She had been Clara's friend, David remembered. One of the many church ladies who had mourned the disappearance of the Tuesday evening Bible study group. "Pastor Coleman," she said, adjusting her reading glasses as she examined the documents he spread across her desk. "I haven't looked at these church blueprints in years. What's got you so interested in ancient history?" "We discovered some structural irregularities in the basement," David replied, choosing his words carefully. "The contractor thinks there might be sealed-off spaces that aren't accounted for in our current building plans." Martha studied the original 1947 blueprints with the methodical attention of someone who had spent years reconciling discrepancies in historical records. "These show the coal cellar here," she said, pointing to a clearly marked room on the east side of the basement. 10 by 12 feet, with access through this corridor. But look at this. She pulled out a different set of plans, dated 1983. "These are the renovation blueprints filed with the county that year. The coal cellar is gone, replaced with this notation, 'Space sealed for structural integrity.'" David leaned closer, his pulse quickening. "Who authorized this renovation? Deacon?" "James Morrison. acting as the church's representative. Martha's finger traced across a signature line. He filed all the permits himself, which was unusual. Normally the pastor would handle building modifications. What happened to Morrison? Died in a car accident the following spring. Terrible tragedy. Lost control on Highway 31 during a rainstorm. Martha paused, studying David's expression. Pastor, is there something specific you're looking for? David hesitated, then decided on partial honesty. The timing concerns me. This renovation happened just months after Clara and the other ladies disappeared. I can't help wondering if there's a connection. Martha removed her glasses and cleaned them slowly, a gesture David recognized as her way of processing difficult information. When she replaced them, her eyes held a new wariness. You know, there were rumors back then. People wondered why the church was doing major construction work so soon after such a tragedy. Some thought it was inappropriate, spending money on buildings when we should have been focusing on finding the missing women. What kind of rumors? Nothing specific, just unease. James Morrison insisted the work was necessary for safety reasons, but he was very secretive about the details. Wouldn't let anyone from the congregation visit the construction site, said it was for insurance purposes. Martha gathered the blueprints with hands that trembled slightly. Pastor, maybe some questions are better left unasked. David studied her carefully. Martha, did you ever suspect something wasn't right about that renovation? She was quiet for a long moment, staring at the 1983 blueprints. James Morrison was a good man, Pastor. Served on the church board for 20 years, never missed a service. But after the ladies disappeared, he changed, became withdrawn, secretive, and when he died. She trailed off, shaking her head. What about when he died? His car went off the road on a perfectly straight stretch of highway. The sheriff said he must have fallen asleep, but James was the most careful driver I ever knew. Martha's voice dropped to a whisper. Sometimes I wondered if guilt was eating at him. Sunset Manor nursing home smelled of antiseptic and resignation, its pale green corridors lined with wheelchairs, and the whispered conversations of families visiting loved ones, caught between memory and forgetting. David found Benjamin Benny Marsh in the sunroom, a skeletal man in his 90s, whose rheumy eyes still held flashes of the sharp intelligence that had made him the most trusted maintenance supervisor in the county for over 50 years. Pastor Coleman, Benny said, his voice a papery whisper as David settled into the chair beside him. Heard you've been asking questions about the old church. Earl Hutchins called me, said you found something strange in the basement. Mr. Marsh, I need to know about the renovation in 1983. You were the head caretaker then, weren't you? Benny's gnarled hands trembled as he adjusted the blanket across his lap. 43 years I worked for that church, Pastor. 43 years, and I ain't never seen nothing like what James Morrison had us do that winter. David leaned forward, sensing the weight of confession in the old man's tone. What did he have you do? Seal up the coal cellar. But it wasn't empty when we sealed it. Benny's eyes drifted toward the window, watching birds gather on the bare branches outside. Morrison said it was contaminated, said we had to pour concrete over everything for safety. But, Pastor, I've been working construction since I was 15 years old, and I know the difference between contamination cleanup and something else. What do you mean it wasn't empty? Benny was quiet for so long that David wondered if the old man had drifted into sleep. Then, with visible effort, he spoke again. There were things down there. Personal things. Women's things. Clothes, shoes, a pocketbook. Morrison said it was old donated items that had gotten moldy, but Pastor. His voice dropped to barely audible. I recognized that pocketbook. It belonged to Mrs. Coleman, your Aunt Clara. David's heart stopped. You're certain? Brown leather with little brass clasps, had her initials burned into the corner. She carried it every Sunday for 20 years. Benny's eyes focused on David with startling clarity. I tried to tell Morrison we should call the sheriff, but he said it would just upset people, make them think the worst about what happened to those ladies. Said they were probably living new lives somewhere and finding their old things would just stir up pain. Did you believe him? At first, Morrison was a deacon, a good Christian man, but when he made us pour that concrete, Benny shuddered, pulling his blanket tighter. He stood there watching every minute, making sure we covered every inch. And his hands, Pastor, his hands were shaking like he had the palsy. That ain't the behavior of a man cleaning up moldy donations. David felt nausea rising in his throat. Was there anything else besides the personal belongings? Benny closed his eyes, and for a moment David thought he wouldn't answer. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of 30 years of suppressed knowledge. There was a smell, Pastor, sweet and sick, like something had died down, there and been left too long. Morrison said it was just mildew, but I worked around death before, helped my daddy prepare bodies for burial when I was young. I know that smell. The old man's eyes opened, fixing on David with an intensity that seemed to burn through the fog of age. Pastor, I carried that secret for 30 years, told myself Morrison knew best, but I ain't got much time left on this. Earth, and if them ladies are still down there. He gripped David's arm with surprising strength. You got to dig them up. You got to give them the Christian burial they deserve. Outside the sunroom windows, storm clouds gathered like dark witnesses to confessions that could no longer be contained. David stood outside Riverside Community Church at 11:47 p.m., keys heavy in his hand as he stared at the familiar building that had become foreign territory in the space of a week. The October wind carried the scent of dying leaves and distant rain, and somewhere in the darkness, an owl called with lonely persistence. He had tried to sleep, tried to pray away the images Benny Marsh had planted in his mind. Clara's brown, leather pocketbook, the sweet sick smell of death, 30 years of concrete silence. But every time he closed his eyes, he saw his aunt's face on that last Sunday morning, heard his own voice encouraging her dedication to the women's ministry. "Forgive me, Lord," he whispered as he unlocked the church's side entrance. "But I have to know." The basement felt different in the darkness, smaller somehow, as if the walls had crept closer while the building slept. David's flashlight beam cut through the blackness, illuminating the water-stained wall that had started this descent into questions he wasn't sure he wanted answered. The concrete looked different now, not like a foundation wall, but like a deliberate barrier. He pressed his ear against the cold surface and listened. Nothing but the building's familiar creaks and the distant hum of the heating system. Yet something felt wrong, a presence that made the hair on his arms stand erect, despite the basement's warmth. Working methodically, David began testing the wall's surface with his hands, searching for the loose sections the contractor had detected. Near the bottom, his fingers found a hairline crack that seemed to follow a deliberate pattern, a rectangle roughly 3 feet wide and 4 feet tall, like a crude doorway that had been hastily sealed. As he traced the outline, David heard something that made his blood freeze. A soft sound, barely audible, coming from somewhere beyond the wall. It might have been water dripping or pipes settling, but to his ear it sounded unnaturally rhythmic, like footsteps. "Hello?" he called softly, feeling foolish even as the word left his lips. The sound stopped immediately, replaced by a silence so complete it seemed to press against his eardrums. David waited, counting his own heartbeats, and then it came again. Not footsteps this time, but something that sounded impossibly like knocking. 3 deliberate taps, followed by silence, then 3 more. David's hands shook as he pulled a small pry bar from Earl's toolbox in the corner. The concrete along the crack was old and brittle, and chunks began to break away with surprising ease. As he worked, a musty odor began to seep through the growing gap. Not the sweet death smell Benny had described, but something equally unsettling, the scent of enclosed spaces and old air that had been trapped for decades. The knocking came again, closer now, and with it a sound that made David drop his tools and step backward in terror. It was a woman's voice, faint but unmistakable, calling his name through 30 years of concrete and darkness. "David? David, is that you?" Clara's voice, unchanged by time or death, reached through the wall like a prayer, finally answered. David's hands moved with desperate precision, chipping away concrete that crumbled like ancient mortar. The voice had fallen silent, but the certainty of what he had heard drove him forward with frantic purpose. Each piece of concrete that fell revealed more of the rectangular outline, and after 20 minutes of fevered work, he had cleared enough. Debris to see the edge of what lay beneath, Old wooden boards painted white but yellowed with age. The opening was large enough to crawl through. David directed his flashlight into the gap and felt his breath catch in his throat. Beyond the makeshift wall lay a room, just as the contractor had suspected, but this was no forgotten storage space or sealed coal cellar. Someone had been living here. The chamber stretched roughly 10 feet in each direction, with concrete walls that showed signs of recent habitation. A narrow cot sat against the far wall, its thin mattress covered with faded floral sheets that David recognized with a start, the same pattern that had adorned the church's nursery 30 years ago. A small wooden table held the remnants of what looked like a meal, crackers scattered across a chipped plate, an empty mason jar, a tarnished spoon. David squeezed through the opening and stood in the hidden room, his flashlight revealing details that made his skin crawl. Someone had lived here recently enough that dust hadn't settled over everything. The air carried a human scent, not the death smell Benny had described, but the close, stale odor of a space where someone had breathed and slept and waited for decades. On the table beside the meal remnants sat a brown leather pocketbook with brass clasps, exactly as Benny had described. David's hands trembled as he opened it, finding Clara's driver's license still tucked in the clear plastic sleeve, her church membership card, and a small notebook filled with her careful handwriting. The final entry was dated October 19, 1982, the night she disappeared. Day 1 in this place, the entry read in Clara's familiar script. Morrison says it's temporary, just until the investigation dies down. Dorothy is frightened, but I keep telling the girls to have faith. God will deliver us from this trial. David flipped through the notebook with growing horror. Entry after entry documented days, then weeks, then months of captivity. Clara's handwriting grew shakier as time progressed, but her faith remained constant, even as she recorded the deaths of her companions, one by one. Day 847. I am the last. Ruth passed in her sleep last night, peacefully, thank the Lord. I buried her beneath the loose floorboard with the others, as she requested. Morrison has not come in 3 days. I fear he may be dead too. If anyone finds this, know that we forgave him long ago. He was sick in his mind, not evil in his heart. David's legs gave out, and he sank onto the cot, staring at the notebook that contained 30 years of hidden truth. Clara had survived. For over 2 years she had survived in this underground prison, maintaining her faith and caring for her companions until the end. But the final entries were dated 1985. The room showed signs of recent occupation, but not that recent. Whoever had been living here was gone now, leaving behind only the evidence of an unimaginable ordeal that had finally ended in darkness. His phone buzzed in his pocket, and David nearly cried out in terror at the sudden sound in the tomb-like silence. David sat in his kitchen at 3 in the morning, Clara's notebook spread open before him like evidence of his own failure. His hands shook as he dialed Sheriff Tommy Briggs's personal number, the one reserved for genuine emergencies in a county where most crises involved cattle loose on highways or domestic disputes that couldn't wait until morning. This better be. Good, Pastor, Tommy's gravelly voice answered after the 4th ring. Someone dead or dying? Tommy, I found them. I found where Clara and the others were kept. David's voice cracked as he spoke. There's a hidden room beneath the church. They were alive for years, Tommy. Years. The silence stretched so long that David wondered if the call had dropped. Finally, Tommy spoke, his tone carefully controlled. Pastor, I need you to slow down and tell me exactly what you found. David explained everything, the basement investigation, the sealed wall, the hidden chamber with its terrible evidence. As he spoke, he could hear Tommy moving around, probably getting dressed, and the sound of his wife's voice asking worried questions in the background. I'm coming over, Tommy said when David finished. Don't go back to that church until I get there, you understand? If what you're telling me is true, this is a crime scene that's been compromised for 30 years. An hour later, David stood in the church parking lot beside Tommy and Deputy Lisa Hernandez, watching their flashlight beams sweep across the building's familiar facade. In the pre-dawn darkness, Riverside Community Church looked different somehow, not like a sanctuary, but like a tomb that had finally surrendered its secrets. Pastor Coleman, Deputy Hernandez said as they approached the entrance, "I need you to understand that if this is some kind of hoax or misunderstanding, there will be serious consequences. False reporting is a felony." "I understand," David replied, leading them toward the basement stairs. "But I also understand that 4 women died in agony, while their families spent 30 years wondering what happened to them." The basement felt even more oppressive with 3 people crowding its confined space. Tommy examined the hole David had carved through the wall with the methodical attention of someone who had processed dozens of crime scenes, while Deputy Hernandez documented everything with her camera. "Jesus Christ," Tommy whispered, as his flashlight illuminated the hidden room. "Lisa, call the State Bureau. We're going to need forensics, the coroner, and every investigator they can spare." As Deputy Hernandez spoke rapidly into her radio, requesting backup and specialized units, Tommy turned to David with eyes that held 30 years of regret. "Pastor, I owe you an apology. We should have found this decades ago." "The question now," David said, staring into the chamber where his aunt had spent her final years, "is who else knew they were down there, and why did no one come forward?" By noon, the church basement had transformed into a hive of investigative activity. Crime scene technicians moved through the hidden chamber with practiced efficiency, photographing every surface and cataloging evidence that told the story of unimaginable suffering. David watched from the basement stairs as they carefully extracted Clara's notebook, the personal belongings scattered throughout the room, and what appeared to be 3 makeshift graves beneath loose floorboards. "Pastor," Detective Sarah Mills from the State Bureau called softly, "we found something you need to see." She led him to a corner of the chamber where investigators had discovered a metal strongbox hidden beneath the cot. Inside lay a collection of documents that made David's blood run cold. Detailed plans for the room's construction, supply lists for long-term captivity, and most damning of all, a confession letter written in James Morrison's familiar handwriting. "He documented everything," Detective Mills said, her voice tight with controlled anger. "The abduction, the construction of this prison, even his rationale for keeping them alive. According to this, he convinced himself he was protecting them from some imagined scandal at the church." David scanned Morrison's rambling justification, recognizing the progressive deterioration of a mind consumed by paranoid delusion. The deacon had believed the women were planning to expose financial irregularities in the church budget, irregularities that existed only in his increasingly unstable imagination. Sheriff Briggs emerged from the chamber carrying an evidence bag containing what appeared to be a small wooden cross. "We found human remains, Pastor. 3 sets, just like your aunt's notebook indicated. The coroner will need to confirm identities, but—" He paused, meeting David's eyes with obvious compassion. "I think Clara was the last to go. There's evidence she cared for the others until the end." As the forensics team continued their methodical work, David found himself staring at the concrete wall that had hidden 30 years of truth. Morrison had sealed these women away like a shameful secret, then carried his guilt to the grave, when guilt finally drove him off that rain-slicked highway. "Detective Mills," David said quietly, "how long do you think Clara survived down here?" "Based on the evidence, possibly into the mid-1980s, maybe longer." She studied the confession letter again. "Morrison stopped visiting regularly after 1984. He may have simply left her to die." The weight of that revelation settled over David like a physical blow. Clara had spent her final years alone in this underground tomb, maintaining her faith, even as hope faded into acceptance, then acceptance into prayer, then prayer into the silence that had lasted until this moment. That evening, David sat in his church office with Detective Mills, reading James Morrison's confession letter in its entirety. The document revealed the methodical planning of a man whose grip on reality had deteriorated beyond recognition, yet whose organizational skills had remained terrifyingly intact. October 19, 1982, the letter began in Morrison's careful script. "I have done what needed to be done to protect this church from scandal. The women discovered my financial arrangements and threatened to expose me to the congregation. I could not allow 40 years of faithful service to be destroyed by their meddling." Detective Mills pointed to a particularly chilling passage. Here's where he describes the abduction. He drugged their coffee during Bible study, then moved them one by one to a storage room he'd prepared beneath the church. He actually believed he was saving them from their own sinful gossiping. David read Morrison's description of the basement construction with growing horror. The deacon had spent months secretly excavating and reinforcing the hidden chamber, telling the church board it was foundation work while actually creating a prison. He had planned every detail: ventilation, drainage, even a primitive waste disposal system. The most disturbing part, Detective Mills continued, is how he rationalized keeping them alive. He genuinely believed that if he provided for their basic needs and gave them time for reflection and prayer, they would eventually thank him for protecting the church's reputation. David's hands trembled as he reached the letter's conclusion. Written in increasingly erratic handwriting, "They have all passed now except Clara, who refuses to see reason. I cannot continue this burden. May God forgive what I believed was righteous judgment." The letter was dated March 15, 1984, almost 18 months after the women's disappearance. Clara had survived in that underground hell for at least 2 more years, completely alone. "He just abandoned her," David whispered, the full weight of Morrison's cruelty finally settling over him. "Left her to die in the dark." 3 weeks later, David stood again at the pulpit of Riverside Community Church, but this time the sanctuary overflowed with faces he had never seen, family members who had traveled from across the country to finally lay their loved ones to rest. The morning sunlight streamed through the same amber windows, but everything had changed. Today we commit to sacred ground the earthly remains of Clara May Coleman, Dorothy Jean Walsh, Beatrice Ann Harper, and Ruth. "Elizabeth Stone," David said, his voice steady despite the emotion that threatened to overwhelm him. "Women who maintained their faith through unimaginable darkness, who cared for one another until the very end, and who have finally come home." The congregation had voted unanimously to seal the basement chamber permanently, transforming it into a memorial garden above ground, where 4 white crosses now stood among newly planted roses. Earl Hutchins had supervised the work personally, ensuring that no trace of Morrison's prison remained to haunt future generations. As David concluded the service, he felt a peace he hadn't known in 30 years. Clara's faith had not been misplaced. Even in her darkest hour, God had been preparing a way for truth to emerge, for justice to find its voice, and for healing to begin. "Though we walk through the valley of the shadow of death," he said, looking out at the faces of the living and thinking of the voices of the dead, "we fear no evil, for you are with us." The mystery that had haunted Riverside Community Church for 3 decades was finally at rest, but the faith that had sustained its victims through their ordeal lived on, stronger than ever in the hearts of those who remembered them.